All right, welcome to the Gray Zone. It's another Friday. I'm Max Blumenthal here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate. We're going to have a special guest later to talk about some reporting we've been doing here in the heart of the beast in Washington, D.C. We're now live on Rockfin, and we're on Twitter at my account at Max Blumenthal. I just made that the old standby account because I have the most followers. Make sure to hit the like button. That really does help us with the Google algorithm. And make sure to share on Twitter or anywhere else, just so we can maximize our view count. Aaron, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks everybody for tuning in and waiting for us as we every week we reduce our late time. This week was only, I think, 5 minutes, which is pretty impressive. So props to us for that. Yeah, please give us a like. That helps.
Yeah, we're better than most US DMVs at wait time. So that's our claim to fame. I got some intros and outros made for our standalone videos, including pushback from our friend Paul Ahern, who's done some work for us in the past, including helping design the Nord Stream bomber t-shirt that was removed by Redbubble on the grounds that it was inappropriate content because it identified Joe Biden as the Nord Stream bomber. But we'll eventually have some live stream intros and countdowns too. But for now, we're just keeping it simple. I mean, it's really all about the content and the analysis, and we're definitely going to bring it today. I mean, so much happened this week. It was another insane week. And of course, US media missed it or spun the biggest events, especially with as they relate to Ukraine. So we're going to cover that. I think, Aaron, we're going to start with, we got Eric Thomas behind the scenes too with us for another week. So we really appreciate his help. But Aaron, I think we should start with the invasion of Russia.
Yeah, they told us this wasn't going to happen. They told us this wasn't going to happen. There wasn't going to be cross-border incursions with U.S. weaponry from Ukraine into Russia. But like everything else, like every other red line that's been crossed, this one, you can check this one off the list too.
Yeah. Well, let's start this segment on a cross-border raid in Russia by showing you how the Financial Times, I think, factually reported it, and how this differed from a lot of the spin from U.S. media, which attempted to portray this as some kind of Russian civil war. Here's the Financial Times. Militias used U.S. armored vehicles in attack over Russian border. Far-right militias who stormed a Russian region bordering Ukraine this week used U.S.-made tactical vehicles in the attack, raising questions over Kyiv's support for Ukraine-based Russian extremist groups. Ukraine has denied direct involvement in the raid on Monday, but one military official acknowledged cooperating with the nationalist groups who on Monday entered Russian territory to liberate a village. And the head of this Russian volunteer corps, we'll show some photos of them a little later, told the Financial Times that his fighters assaulting the Belgorod region, the border region in Russia, were in possession of American-made vehicles. These included at least two M1224 Max Pro armored vehicles. Those are the MRAPs that you commonly see in U.S. convoys, and several Humvees, he said, while declining to disclose how they were obtained. And these images were all over the place. For that piece, by the way, was authored by Christopher Miller, who used to be at the U.S. government publication Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe. It's interesting how they feed them into international publications that are supposedly independent of government influence. And he referred to the Russian Volunteer Corps as far-right fighters, but this is actually a banned group inside Russia that is neo-Nazi. And these are neo-Nazi organization. This is a neo-Nazi organization. And one of the leaders of this group was asked about being a neo-Nazi by the international press. After this failed border raid, we should point out that it was a completely failed raid in which everyone involved was either captured or killed or forced to flee. And here he's asked about it.
Do you describe yourself as a neo-Nazi? Do you mind being described as a neo-Nazi?
I don't think it's an insult. I don't care about that. I mean, what can I do about it?
Do you mind being described as a neo-Nazi?
Media, so you can call me pedophile. You can call me neo-Nazi. You can call me whatever you want. What can I do against it?
You can call me a pedophile. You can call me a neo-Nazi. You can call me whatever you want. Well, you can see that flag behind him is a ultra-nationalist or neo-Nazi flag. And many of the figures involved in the leadership of this organization were in neo-Nazi circles in Russia before they got weaponized by the Ukrainian military to carry out these kind of attacks, which clearly, in my view, and in the view of so many others who are observing this closely, was partly designed to distract from the catastrophic Ukrainian defeat in Bakhmut, which Zelensky had described before U.S. Congress as Ukraine's Battle of Saratoga. So, and it successfully did that in some senses. The U.S. media was much, turned its attention to this. But then we have the issue of U.S. weapons going to neo-Nazi groups backed by the Ukrainian military, as Financial Times acknowledged, Aaron.
Yeah, and let me show you how the New York Times reported this. They pointed out this about the raid. They said, already the Kremlin has said that the raiders abandoned American-made military vehicles inside Russia, and Moscow can use the far-right histories of some of the raiders to bolster its largely false claim to be fighting Nazis in Ukraine. I had never seen this verbiage before. So before I was told that Russia's claim to be fighting Nazis is false, right? It's Russian propaganda. Now, according to the Times, it's largely false. So the question becomes, like, how large is that falsehood, and what part of the claim to be fighting Nazis is true? Like, can we get a percentage from the New York Times? I think that would be helpful, because how can something be largely false? It's a strange way to put it.
Largely false, but there's some truth to it. We just won't say how much truth there is, but it's more false than true.
More false than true, right? Sure, yeah. So there's more people inside. Basically, there's more people inside Ukraine who are not Nazis than are Nazis. Fair enough, and that's what we've always said. But the point is, there are Nazis, and they do have major influence, and they do carry out operations like this. And it's just interesting that this is how the New York Times copes with that.
Well, here's some more of the largely non-Nazi Russian volunteer corps. This is just a look at who they are. These look like, are they just far right, or?
Потому что победа Российской Федерации в этой войне будет означать торжество преступного режима и гибель русского народа. Мы на своей земле, в своем родном городе. Мы здесь, чтобы спасти русскую.
So, I mean, you have guys that look like
который ведет к вымиранию русской нации. А повсеместной коррупции, которая с каждым днем
the Russian version of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, talking about carrying out regime change in Russia, attacking their own government, and a separatist project, and they're waving the flag of football ultras. In other words, they're football hooligans. They're saying that we draw from the ranks of football hooligans to fill the Russian volunteer corps. And this is who is getting U.S. weapons. I mean, we're not talking just about small arms. We're talking about heavy weapons, MRAPs, Humvees. They're getting them from the Ukrainian military. And Denis Nikitin, who is the leader of the Russian volunteer corps, told the Financial Times, well, he refused to tell the Financial Times how he got those weapons. But it's the same thing we saw on the Syrian battlefield, where the FSA, this fake moderate rebel group, was created by the CIA with supposedly moderate leadership who had supposedly been trained in moderation to take over and cause a democratic transition. And they all just became a weapons farm for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we eventually saw Jabhat al-Nusra carrying US TOW missiles, BGM TOW missiles built by Raytheon into the field. We saw it again and again and again, and US media always would show the pictures, but they didn't seem troubled by the fact that the organization responsible for 9/11 was being armed by the US. And it's the same with these neo-Nazis. Joe Biden at Howard University's commencement address, the most prestigious historically Black college in the US, declared white supremacy to be the number one terror threat in the United States. And here we are providing neo-Nazis with not just TOW missiles or small arms, but MRAPs, Humvees.
Yeah. And going back to Syria for a second, one of the reasons why the U.S. Classified its program in Syria as covert is, in the words of one Obama administration official, a senior administration official, this is from the New York Times, quote, "We needed plausible deniability in case the arms got into the hands of al-Nusra." So one of the major reasons for the secrecy was that they knew the weapons would get into the hands of Al-Qaeda, and that's why it had to be kept secret, because otherwise it would make it more difficult to, answer the fact that U.S. weapons are going right to Al-Qaeda. So that was admitted, of course, after the fact.
And John Kirby at the Pentagon said that it would be unacceptable if U.S. arms had fallen into the hands of these neo-Nazis. But just days before Kirby's statement, the State Department said that it didn't happen. Here's a State Department skeptical that U.S. weapons were used in alleged Belgorod uprising. This wasn't an uprising. These were not organizations that came from Belgorod. Actually, residents were terrified. One civilian was killed. Many were injured, and people were not happy about it there. The U.S. is skeptical, according to The Hill, that American provided military equipment to Ukraine was used in an outbreak of fighting, the State Department said Tuesday, adding that Washington does not encourage or enable Ukraine to strike inside of Russia. Matthew Miller is the State Department spokesman. And here's what he said that I love this quote. "We don't have perfect clarity of the information. We're looking at the same fuzzy images on social media." So because the images,
funny. They have every inch of Ukraine covered under surveillance. The U.S. can see everything. That was made clear from these Pentagon leaks that the U.S. is tapping, Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky. They know exactly what's going on. Whenever something like this is inconvenient, it's unclear. We're just looking at social media. We don't know. Yeah, it doesn't pass the laugh test.
Yeah, fuzzy images. Well, if you're watching this, just look up the images right now. They're not very fuzzy. They're all over mainstream media. So this is like the most pathetic attempt at skirting the fact that the U.S. has been not just supplying, but training neo-Nazis. There are plentiful photos of U.S. and Canadian officers inside NATO training bases going back to 2017 with leadership of the Azov battalion. But of course, now they're not Nazis anymore. They're defenders. So this is the more disturbing aspect, I thought, of Matthew Miller's comments. He said, while we don't encourage or enable attacks outside Ukraine's borders, we'll leave it to our Ukrainian partners on how to conduct this war. So basically, we don't stop them either from attacking inside Russia, these neo-Nazis. And that's the same thing that Tony Blinken said when asked, I think it was by David Ignatius on Press Freedom Day, about the Kremlin, the attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin with a drone attack on the Kremlin. So this is the kind of rhetoric we're getting from the official spokesperson of the State Department after a neo-Nazi raid, cross-border raid, sponsored by Ukraine's government.
And just going back to what you mentioned, this was the Grayzone back. This is you back in 2018. The U.S. is arming and assisting neo-Nazis in Ukraine while Congress debates prohibition. So, and
that you can see in some of those photos. Well, that's a U.S. rocket launcher. It's a U.S. rocket launcher. It's like the PSIL-1. But you can see if you just stop it right there. I mean, these are, circled. You can see the Azov flag here and the U.S. flag. This is a U.S. officer. And Denis Prokopenko, who is the official military head of the Azov battalion, the person who was put in place of Andrei Beletsky until Beletsky returned recently. Prokopenko was a part of that training session with U.S. and Canadian officers.
Beletsky was recently quoted in the New York Times as just some military person. Didn't even mention that he's a Nazi. He's just happens to be a Ukrainian military officer. Didn't mention who he actually is. I mean, just the normalization of neo-Nazis. No one has done it more than liberal media outlets like the Times. It's off the charts.
He's just a patriot, or he's a Ukrainian activist. Didn't they call him an activist?
I'll have to double check. That's yeah.
Well, I understand from the leader of the Russian Volunteer Corps who gave this press conference, Denis Nikitin, and he's not to be confused with the Patch, that he said to expect more cross-border raids. And this appears to be a tactic that it betrays desperation, along with all the terrorist attacks being carried out by dubious elements backed by the Ukrainian SBU inside Russia against writers and intellectuals who support the Russian war effort. It suggests there isn't a whole lot of progress on the battlefield.
Here, I found that quote about Beletsky. It's from the New York Times. It's really interesting. First of all, the word we got about Beletsky was that he was done. He left the Azov battalion. He wasn't involved anymore. And this was presented as proof that they're no longer Nazis. And then we find out that he actually was leading the Azov in the fight in Bakhmut, right? So this guy's playing a operational role as a commander in this huge battle. So, okay, so much for that cover story. But this is how now the Times describes Beletsky in its piece. Let me show it to you. This is a new one. They say this: the fight in Bakhmut is led by Beletsky, a former ultranationalist politician and founder of the Azov Regiment. No mention, of course, that these are Nazis. A group that was part of Ukraine's National Guard before the war and is now integrated into the country's military forces with little or no political bent.
He's a former ultranationalist. It's like, he's reformed now. He's apologized. He's gone to Ibrahim X. Kendi racial sensitivity workshops. He's done the privilege walk, and now he's a former ultranationalist.
Former ultranationalist, yeah. Former ultranationalist, just like yeah. No need to say anything more. And now there's no more political bent at all. Nothing more to see here.
This is the guy who said that the goal of Azov was to, the mission of Azov was to destroy the Semite-led Untermenschen and lead the white Christian races to victory. This is
he snapped out of it. He snapped out of it. It's former. Doesn't feel that way anymore. And you mentioned the drone strike on the Kremlin. Again, this is another thing where it's just a little time passes and the story shifts quickly and everybody moves on. This is from the New York Times. Breaking news: the recent Kremlin drone attack was likely orchestrated by one of Ukraine's special military or intelligence units, U.S. officials said. It was unclear if Ukraine's top officials were aware. Yeah, right. But the point is, when this first happened, what did the media tell us? What did experts tell us? This was a Kremlin false flag. So,
Timothy Snyder, the Yale court historian of the Ukraine proxy war, said this was a Russian false flag. Who else was it?
Jack Keane of the Institute for the Study of War,
the
Kagan
Kagan
family think tank. He said that Robert O'Brien, the former Trump national security advisor, they all said this is the hallmarks of a Russian false flag. But again, that's like, it's old news now. There's only a few weeks ago. Now, okay, now we could admit it. Oh, yeah, Ukraine carried this out, but let's move on.
Moving right along, and this couldn't have any possible consequences for Ukraine's military and political leadership when it's confirmed now that Ukraine attempted to assassinate the Russian president. When the deputy intelligence chief of Ukraine says their goal is to assassinate the Russian president, this couldn't have any possible consequences for Ukraine political leadership.
Yeah.
So I think we should, you should intro the next segment.
Okay. Well, we've been hearing for months from U.S. officials that they don't really know what Ukraine's plans are because Ukraine doesn't share with the U.S. their operational plans. So U.S. has very little insight into what Ukraine plans to do and its counteroffensive. Well, someone who just blew up that talking point is one of the top neocons in government and one of the people most responsible for this proxy war inside the Biden administration, Victoria Nuland.
And even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months, we are already beginning our discussions with the Ukrainian government and with friends in Kyiv, both in the civilian side and on the military side, about Ukraine's long-term future. And
let's hear that one more time.
Even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months.
So there we go. That's Victoria Nuland admitting that, oh yeah, we've been working with you, the Ukrainians, on this counteroffensive for 4 to 5 months. And during this period, there's so many headlines that you'll get from, sourced U.S. officials saying that we don't know what Ukraine's doing. They're withholding details. And Nuland just blurted out the truth, which is that, of course, because this is a proxy war, the U.S. has been actively planning this counteroffensive with Ukraine.
And this is the Kyiv security conference modeled after the Munich security conference. And she comes in on a big screen looking like Big Brother. She really is the boss of the show. She is a literal boss lady of the Ukrainian U.S. fiefdom and this proxy war. She wanted to take credit for the counteroffensive, at least. I mean, why wouldn't she?
Yep.
And so where is it? We were constantly told the spring counteroffensive would take place. It was floated that it would begin on April 30th, which was the day that Hitler died. Maybe not the best day, especially if it's going to fail. And we're still seeing no signs of it yet. It was reported by the Institute for the Study of War, which is managed by Iran and was founded by the sister of Victoria Nuland's husband, Robert Kagan. His sister is Kimberly Kagan, that Ukrainian troops had advanced across the Dnipro River. This was then reported in the Wall Street Journal and every other legacy publication in the US, and it turned out to be totally false. And Bakhmut fell a few weeks later. So it seems like they're getting a little ahead of themselves. And we've been reporting on how the US media had been spinning the reality in Bakhmut and cheering on Ukrainian troops as if they were some kind of sports team, as if they were local, like they were local St. Louis Cardinals reporters reporting on a Cardinals Royals series, World Series or something. It wasn't accurate reporting. Then I remember Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group that is sort of like US enemy number one now, the private mercenary group that was basically manning the front lines of the fight for Bakhmut on the Russian side, announced that Russia was not supplying him adequately, that he was furious at the Kremlin, that he was disgusted, and that his men were exhausted. And US media seemed to completely fall for it, which sent the message to Ukrainian troops and Zelensky himself, who had been rumored to be rejecting his senior command's recommendations to pull back from Bakhmut, to actually reinforce troops, send more troops in. And then they were resoundingly defeated. And it looked like Prigozhin pulled a fast one, that this was actually a kind of psyop. So the whole US media fell for that. Bakhmut fell a few days later. And Prigozhin stands there as the triumphant leader. And now his organization is set to be replaced by Russian regular forces in a battle, once again, that Zelensky personally described in his address to Congress as Ukraine's Battle of Saratoga. That was the battle in the U.S. War of Independence, in which the U.S. convinced France to join on the U.S. side against the British because they saw how much military progress they were making. So by Zelensky's own logic, the U.S. should maybe take a step back here. I don't know if they're going to do that.
Well, if Prigozhin was running a psyop there, I have to say, I thought he was pretty convincing because he really seemed sincere to me, and I didn't know what to think, whether it was a psyop or not. But I can see why that would make sense given how the whole battle ended. But good acting job on his part. If he really was just fronting, if he really was acting. He was pretty convincing. But going back to that conference where Nuland spoke, the Kyiv Security Forum, there's something really sad about it, listening to it. All these Ukrainian officials who spoke, their top priority, from what I gathered, was joining NATO. And one speaker there who was on the stage asked Nuland, what do you think about us joining NATO? And all the U.S. officials, including Nuland, gave the same answer that, well, we're focused on, shoring up Ukraine's defenses for now, and we're willing to, make you increasingly interoperable with NATO, military infrastructure. But nobody said we're going to give you NATO membership. It's like it seemed to me as if all these Ukrainian officials really have been strung along and led to believe that they're actually going to get NATO membership, when of course the whole goal for the U.S. and its allies of dangling NATO for Ukraine was to bait Russia. Right? It wasn't to actually give Ukraine NATO membership. It was just to bait Russia, and to allow it to train up its Ukrainian forces and to put military infrastructure inside Ukraine. But actually to give it membership, it doesn't seem to me as if that's an actual possibility, at least for the short term. But all these Ukrainian officials, they all seem convinced that it's going to happen soon, and they all really want it to happen soon. But it doesn't seem like it is. So there's just something, I don't know, kind of sad about it. And about these Ukrainians being used and given the false hope that this is going to happen. And Nuland, meanwhile, her priority just basically was, arming up Ukraine for the long term and talking about this fight continuing for many, many, many years and years and years. So her vision to me just seems to be perpetual conflict with Russia, even if there's some sort of ceasefire now to end this phase, but to keep on using Ukraine as a bulwark so that conflict continues. And the way you allow conflict to continue is to not give Ukraine NATO membership, because if you did give Ukraine NATO membership, then that would obligate the U.S. and its allies to fight on Ukraine's side in the future. So the way to keep the conflict going and just use Ukraine to fight Russia is to not give Ukraine NATO membership, but to keep dangling that prospect and to keep giving Ukrainians the false belief that it's going to happen.
Yeah, and it was Ursula von der Leyen who dangled EU membership before Ukraine as well. Something we know they'll never do, because it would mean making all Ukrainians EU citizens, people fleeing the poorest country in Europe. They're not going to do that. They're giving Ukrainians free movement around the EU, but they're not going to actually allow them to be citizens. They're going to exploit them as cheap labor, Uber drivers, and they're going to traffic them. And then NATO is not going to allow Ukraine in, at least at this point. Why? Because they, first of all, have already NATO-fied Ukraine. I mean, if you pour in weapons, you pour in NATO trainers, you get the benefits of NATO for NATO without actually having to exercise Article 5. You render Article 5 completely meaningless if you formally make Ukraine a part of NATO, and then you actually have to directly confront Russia. So it's sort of NATO on the cheap.
Yep. Well, speaking of a proxy war supporter who is pretty indifferent to the consequences of using Ukraine to bleed Russia. Let's go to this guy. His name is Gerald Nadler, and he was asked about, his concerns about, the U.S. Ukraine using U.S. weapons, including F-16s, to attack Russia.
Wait, and if you're not an American, Jerry Nadler is the ranking chair of I think the House Judiciary Committee. He's a very close ally of Biden. So these are consequential. He's not some backbencher in Congress. These are consequential comments.
It's high time. It should have been done a long time ago.
Go ahead.
And then what do you think about his previous comments, though, that it was too escalatory to do, now it's not?
I think he was wrong. I think, every different weapon system first is too escalatory, and then we eventually gave it to them. And they're fighting not only for their lives, they're fighting for democracy, they're fighting for the world order against, just invasion of another country, altering borders by force, which is inadmissible since 1945. And we should give them whatever they need.
And are you concerned that they will enter into Russian territory, as there have been recent reports of Belgorod, the border city?
I'm not concerned. I wouldn't care if they did.
You wouldn't care if they went into Russia?
Nope.
Really? You would still support them?
Turnabout's fair play. I don't think they're going to do it in any large scale. But why should Russia feel that they can invade somebody else and have total safety at home?
Well, but that would cross the line to a U.S. sanctioned invasion of Russia by
You don't have to
Ukraine.
sanction it.
Well, you would be providing the weapons that conducted it, is what I'm saying. Is if the
We're not
F-16s
providing it for that purpose. I said I personally wouldn't mind.
You personally wouldn't mind, but you are a representative of the government.
Well, I'm part of the government. I'm not part of the executive branch.
Right.
But
So
I think we should give them whatever they need.
okay, and if an F-16 was to be used on Russia, you wouldn't come out and say that's too much. It's too far.
No, I don't think that's going to happen in any event. But no, they're going to use F-16s for air defense, basically.
But there are these
And-
reports
and-
right now that American weapons are being used in Belgorod, which is a Russian territory. It's already happening.
That may be, but they're not going to use major weapons. I mean, things like F-16s, they need for air defense over Ukraine so that they can provide air cover for their counterattack and things like that. They're not going to waste it in Russia.
Great questions by Liam Cosgrove. We definitely need more reporters like that roving the halls of Congress, since we're not allowed to go into Congress since January 6th. Why? Because of COVID. The public can't go in anymore. So thank you, Liam, for confronting Jerry Nadler about those issues. The Biden administration has finally ceded to demands from people like the biggest neocon in Congress, Lindsey Graham, to provide Ukraine with F-16s through its Western partners. And key members of Congress, key Biden administration allies, are saying they don't care if those are used to attack Russia. So we can see the escalation ladder just we're constantly climbing. And the question is, while climbing the escalation ladder, we're constantly crossing red lines. Is it making any difference on the battlefield? I mean, it started with the javelins, then the howitzers, then the HIMARS, then the Patriot batteries, and now the F-16s.
Leopard tanks.
Leopard tanks, Challenger tanks. I think maybe their depleted uranium shells were blown up recently in a strike on a NATO warehouse. Is any of it really making a difference in doing anything other than possibly extending the war? It's sort of like the approach that the U.S. took to arming the so-called rebels in Syria, where they were never going to be able to overrun Damascus. But what they were able to do was terrorize the population enough and move close enough to the Alawite heartland of Latakia to trigger Russian intervention, which then just completely squashed the whole dirty war and wound up and rolled it up by 2017. This is a piecemeal approach that the U.S. is taking that I don't think will turn the tide of battle in any way. So what is the point of it? Other than to simply provoke Russia?
Yeah, it's the same goal from the start, to keep the war going for as long as possible, to keep the fight contained to inside Ukraine and, I guess now across the border into Russia, but to keep NATO out of it and just basically keep sacrificing Ukrainians. That's why the U.S. blocked multiple peace efforts. That's why the U.S. has like drip fed weapons slowly. That's why, the U.S. is like the biggest influx of weaponry came in the spring of 2022 after the U.S. blocked the peace initiative, via Boris Johnson, because the aim is just to keep the war going for as long as possible. And how do people like progressives who voted to fund this proxy war on the grounds that we need to help Ukraine defend itself, how do they justify the fact that the Biden administration is actively opposed to diplomacy at every single turn, every juncture, every time there's an opportunity for diplomacy? Like when China recently floated the prospect of a ceasefire, John Kirby said, he's a White House spokesperson, said that would be unacceptable. Anthony Blinken said it would be a trap, right? I mean, they're just openly hostile to any pause in the fighting. That's because they want to keep it going for as long as they can.
Completely. And then there's the profit motivation, the profit motive. And it was interesting. I was actually looking at Raytheon stocks when the Patriot battery was damaged and possibly destroyed in Kiev. You could see their stocks went down markedly. Their stocks were up thanks to the Ukraine proxy war. Then their stocks went down. So the future of the arms industry really hinges on the continuation of this proxy war. And then you have so many other contractors who have skin in the game inside the Beltway. So why let a good thing go to waste? Let's keep fighting this war down to the last Ukrainian, as Lindsey Graham said. Turn a few profits. This is a giant washing machine. Yeah. Afghanistan was no longer going to be able to be sustained as a washing machine. The pandemic was coming to an end, which enriched many people. How did it enrich them? It enriched them through the CARES Act and through sort of soaking the public for money to pay the vaccine makers, to pay the tech industry, to sponsor everyone who is profiting from the pandemic. It immediately shifts to Ukraine. And they are enriching themselves. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, they're enriching themselves through corporate welfare from us. And we're going to talk in our next segment about one of the more disgusting examples of corporate welfare to Ukraine, how this war is another reason why this war is being extended, which is to enrich the tech industry and advance the fourth industrial revolution. But I feel like there are a few more pieces we can add here.
Yeah. Well, let's see how the Biden administration is coping with the loss of Bakhmut, which we were told for a long time had, huge strategic value for Ukraine. But now that it's lost, the White House is changing its tune.
The infamous Wagner mercenary group is handing control of Bakhmut to regular Russian troops. Does that provide a window for Ukraine in its expected counteroffensive?
Well, I want to be careful here, not to speak to future operations for the Ukrainians. I'll let them do that. But as we've said all along, even before the Russians claimed they had Bakhmut, that getting Bakhmut was going to be a little strategic value to the Russians. There's really no strategic value on that front around Donbass. It doesn't really give the Russians much in terms of leeway or more flexibility. The Ukrainians will respond, and they'll respond appropriately. They will conduct this counteroffensive on their own terms. When and where and how they strike, they'll make those decisions. What we're focused on is making sure that as they make those decisions and as they conduct those operations, they've got all the tools and capabilities and the training that they need. And we have been in lockstep with the Ukrainians for months now, making sure that they have everything they need if and when they want to launch a counteroffensive. And that includes, Wolf, packages of security assistance that just got announced last week in Hiroshima. And I fully anticipate you'll see additional security assistance packages coming in the coming weeks and months.
John.
Yeah, so that's what they call a cope. And then here's CNN. This is our friend Wyatt Reed did a great job showing the contradictions in CNN's narrative, which by extension is the State Department and Pentagon's narrative. This is October 20th, 2022. The significance of the city of Bakhmut cannot be overstressed. And it points out that Bakhmut is a major transportation center. So you're cutting off your enemy's supply lines if you take Bakhmut. It points toward two other strategic towns in the Donetsk region, Konstantinivka to the southwest, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk to the northwest. All three are key to Putin's total control of the region, total control of the Donbass region. While Bakhmut's strategic importance should not be overstated, according to CNN on March 2nd, 2023, its capture also carries a symbolic impact. Okay. March 22nd, 2023, just 3 weeks later, Bakhmut has limited strategic value. And then this is after the fall, May 20th, 2023. The city's symbolism always outweighed its strategic importance. So, yeah, that didn't work out too well. And it's simply true that it is a major transport center. It does have strategic significance. But there's also the fact that Ukraine, I mean, both sides took heavy losses, but Ukraine lost something like 60 to 65,000 casualties. That's massive. I mean, they were determined to hold and win Bakhmut, and they failed. 15,000 dead or so. I mean, the number is a top secret of the Ukrainian state, but that's what we're estimating. And one of the goals, the stated goals of Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, was to bleed Ukraine. And we can now see that Ukraine is having trouble replenishing units with experienced soldiers. So this goal seems to have been achieved as well, but it's understated, if not completely whitewashed by US media. Why? Because they don't want the US public to know that their billions and their support is going to a losing cause or to a stalemate, to a frozen conflict. They don't want them to get up and start clamoring for negotiations. So they're not telling them.
Yeah. Yeah. And the media has done such a impressive job, you have to say, at staying on message discipline. Occasionally you'll get like an article or two and the Times or the Post admitting the reality, but otherwise it's just straight up message discipline. On cable news, 100%. Like the one time when CBS News reported that like only 30% of US weapons were actually reaching the front lines, that got deleted after the Pentagon and Ukraine complained. So the message discipline is uniform. It's across the board. And they're a partner in the proxy war. They're basically a partner. They're the media arm, the propaganda arm of this whole operation. Without the media being so obedient and subservient, this could not keep going the way it is.
Well, if you believe Hillary Clinton, this whole conflict and the reason Russia is in Ukraine is because of Donald Trump. Everything comes down to Trump. I mean, this really distills the delusional, ignorant, primitive, atavistic perspective of the blue anon liberal intelligentsia. When you hear Hillary Clinton attempt to explain why this war is taking place.
And he launched his second invasion of Ukraine, in part because Trump lost, because he thought if Trump had won, Trump would have pulled us out of NATO. It would have literally been a cakewalk for him. And so when Trump didn't win, he figured he had to go forward. He thought he had enough chits with the Germans and others to prevent a united front in support of Ukraine against his invasion. He turned out to have absolutely the wrong calculation. And he launched his invasion, second invasion of Ukraine, in part because...
So, but isn't she also basically like admitting that it's Biden's fault? Because she's saying that if Biden had lost, then Russia wouldn't have invaded. So she's actually, I mean, she's not the first person to admit this. The former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who became like hero during Trump's first impeachment, Marie
Yovanovitch.
Yeah. She also said that if Trump had won re-election, that Russia wouldn't have invaded. So okay, and you guys want to celebrate that? You want to celebrate the fact that your guy led to Russia being like Russia launching an invasion? Like, okay, if they want to admit that, all right.
Yeah. So what are they making a case that Trump should have been elected? Because Trump himself says that. He said this would have never happened if I had been there. It would have never happened.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what I think an American leader and diplomat should be saying. But you have Lindsey Graham. Remember when Lindsey Graham went with Klobokop, Amy Klobuchar and John McCain, I think they went to Ukraine and they met with some of the far-right militias. And Lindsey Graham said 2017 is going to be the year of offense. Do you remember that?
I do. I'm going to pull up that clip.
I can see in your eyes that you're pulling up a clip.
Yeah, because I mean, this is a classic. This is a classic clip, and for those who haven't seen it, you're in for a treat. We probably played this clip, thousands of times on the Grayzone, but I can't get enough of it. This is late 2016, so Trump has won.
Yeah.
So Trump has won an election, and Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and Amy Klobuchar are there on the front lines to cheer the soldiers on and basically give them orders to tell them to keep fighting this war in the Donbass that began after a coup that they backed back in 2014.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже, щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Я вірю в те, що ви виграєте, переможете. Я переконаний в тому, що ви переможете, і ми вам допоможемо всіма можливими засобами.
Inspiring. Well, I see that in a different light now.
Yeah.
Because what Lindsey Graham was saying is Hillary Clinton is going to win the election and 2017 will be the year of offense. And Hillary Clinton was essentially saying that.
Yeah. And when Hillary lost, Lindsey Graham and McCain still made sure it was the year of offense because they all used Russiagate, this fake allegation generated by Clinton that Trump was a Russian asset. They used that to help pressure Trump to show that he wasn't subservient to Russia by escalating the proxy war exactly as they had called for to make it the year of offense. So Trump authorized weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't even send. So Lindsey Graham turned out to be prophetic because 2017 did become the year of offense. And that's why Trump, when he claims that he would have prevented the war, whatever his own intentions were, his policies did play a role in bringing us to the war that we're in today. And, we wouldn't have had that, I don't think, without Russiagate, which played a major role in that. So that bipartisan consensus behind a proxy war, it long predates 2022 when Russia invaded. This has been the bipartisan consensus for years.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the impeachment of Donald Trump and so many of those figures. Marie Yovanovitch, she's of Ukrainian descent. She's
in that video, by the way. She's in that video with them in that room.
Yeah, then you got Alexander Vindman, born in Kiev. He's now a major cheerleader for the war in Ukraine, and it's been reported that he's actually profiting off it through a contractor. George Kent, these characters came out of the woodwork. We never heard of him. He said his wife was Ukrainian, and he called the Azov battalion Minutemen.
Yep. Yeah.
Then you had Vindman's boss, trying to remember his name. He stated in the impeachment hearings that if we don't fight them over there, referring to the Russians, we will have to fight them over here. So what was the impeachment really about?
Yeah, it was about making sure that that was the bipartisan consensus that, how dare Trump briefly pause some weapons to Ukraine that keep that proxy war going, that keep the year of offense going, that make Russians pay a heavier price, as Lindsey Graham called for. These are the people who are really in charge of U.S. policy in Ukraine, and their achievement was making it fully bipartisan. I mean, now they have every single progressive on their side, everybody, with not one dissenter. So they've won when it comes to the debate, at least inside the U.S.
And I heard it through the grapevine that you're working on a book about this.
I am.
Connecting Russiagate to Ukraine.
Yes.
So how's that coming?
Yeah, that's coming. That is coming. I don't know when it'll be published, but I'm finishing it as soon as I can.
Good. Well, we need that. I mean, it couldn't come any sooner.
Yeah.
Because, if we look at the trajectory from the Obama administration, 2014, Maidan, MH17, all those events, the key actors behind them are back in the building now with Victoria Nuland taking the lead. And they managed to get through the Trump administration by deploying Russiagate to criminalize diplomacy, as Stephen Cohen said, and made this invasion, in my opinion, in the opinion of John Mearsheimer, who just spoke in Washington, who said that he'd never, one of the leading IR professors, experts in international relations in the US, said he'd never been called on by any Democrat or Republican elected official. He said that the invasion was essentially a fait accompli by 2022. They made it so through Russiagate by essentially outlawing diplomacy.
Mearsheimer said something really interesting to me. I've always argued that, I don't think Russia's invasion could be justified, because I think to justify an invasion, you have to show you've exhausted all other non-military options. Mearsheimer said, and I think this is a important statement coming from him. He said Putin had no other options. He was asked about it by Ray McGovern. Ray asked John Mearsheimer, do you think Russia had other options? And John Mearsheimer said no. No, Russia didn't. And I just thought, the fact that Mearsheimer is saying that, I think that's, even though I don't agree with it, at least without, arguing it with him, I think that's important to acknowledge that someone who's really studied this conflict very, very deeply is of that opinion. I just think that's important.
And that he's been completely frozen out of, policy decision-making circles. Sure. Along with Stephen Walt, his co-author on the Israel lobby.
Of course.
One of the key figures in destroying them was Jeffrey Goldberg, who was the salesman of the Iraq War.
Of course. I didn't know that.
And is now the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine, which is what did Jeffrey Goldberg just write at the Atlantic? Pop quiz.
Oh, that was his thing with Ann Applebaum?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Bono illustrated cover story about how Ukraine is winning or something like that, or?
Yeah, exactly. And so, Jeffrey Goldberg's now cheering on the inevitable counteroffensive and claiming that it's going to possibly allow Ukraine to retake Crimea. And he's co-authoring it with neocon Ann Applebaum, the wife of Radoslav Sikorsky, who thanked the U.S. for bombing the Nord Stream pipeline. Before we bring in our special guest and move on to another segment, I really, I can't not show this video of Ann Applebaum speaking at the commencement ceremony, being rewarded for her neoconservative warmongering, the commencement ceremony of one of the major conformist mills and neocon training centers in America, Johns Hopkins University. You got to see this.
Johns Hopkins University faculty and Johns Hopkins parents, I am proud to introduce the 2023 commencement speaker. In our time, at this particular historical moment, no one better represents the qualities that this university shares: bravery, optimism, and faith in open societies and democratic values.
Oh, I wonder who it's going to
We
be.
could not be prouder that he is joining
Oh
us
my
today
God, they're
from
so
Ukraine,
excited.
where he is leading the struggle to keep his country free and Europe safe. Welcome, President Zelensky, to Johns Hopkins.
Stand and salute. You're all the same. You all are the same.
Thank you.
He does bar mitzvahs. He does award shows. He does commencement speeches. The guy has room in his calendar for everything. He went to every single international summit recently. He went to the Arab League summit for some reason. He then went to the G7. He's everywhere, but inside his own country, supposedly leading it in war, which is what I thought a leader is supposed to do. He's got a lot of time in his schedule to do all these public events.
Well, that's Johns Hopkins SICE, which is, the future of the neoconservative movement and pretty much the liberal humanitarian interventionist movement as well. It's just a training mill for the future war of the war state.
Since you mentioned it, Max, let's show that clip of Ann Applebaum's husband being questioned about his tweet thanking the U.S. for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines.
This is going into the Bilderberg group.
All right, hello.
How about that tweet where you said thank you after the Nord Stream incident? Would you like to explain that one? It was a very interesting one. Okay, well, have a wonderful stay in Lisbon, and I hope you have a very productive meeting.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, USA. He didn't want to elaborate though on his gratitude to the U.S.
He deleted the tweet, but that's on his way into Bilderberg, the secretive meeting of transatlantic elites. Radoslav Sikorski, former Polish foreign minister, and that was Joshua Friedman, one of the few roving journalists on the scene. The Western press doesn't ever seem interested in Bilderberg. It's all off the record, and the only reporters on the scene are the ones inside the building, like the head of The Economist, the top foreign policy correspondent for Financial Times, and the head of the Axel Springer Media Group. They're all inside, bound to Chatham House rules, and they don't comment on what's happening. They're busy planning. So we want to bring on a special guest who actually was trained at the other, was trained and cultivated at the other warmonger mill in Washington, the George Washington Elliott School. That's our own Anya Parampil. Anya, welcome to the stream.
Hey, I dropped out of GW, so they can't totally take credit.
GW dropout, Anya Parampil. That's what it says on your Grayzone bio. Anya's here taking a break from completing work on her book on Venezuela.
It's done. I swear. It's already submitted and done. I know I've been talking about it forever, but yeah, I just had one little thing that I had to do. So I'm still doing that. But I promise it's not just something that I was like talking about all this time and not actually doing. Max at least can vouch for me because he knows that I pretty much didn't do anything other than that book. And he had to put up with it. So
we have some dishes upstairs that have been there for like 5 months. It's like a sign. No, I'm joking. But Anya, our viewers really want you back.
I want to be back, and I'm happy to be back. I hope that when the book comes out, people understand why I took time to do it the way that I wanted to do it, because I could have already been done with it, but I decided there was just one little piece left that I had to add to kind of just explain to everyone why I just spent 2.5 years, or no, 2 years actually, writing a book about Venezuela. Like why did I do that? So instead of just dropping you into the middle of Venezuela, I'm trying to just give you a little preface as to why I thought it was important to do that, and why the lessons that came from the story and the reporting that I have on Venezuela are really part of everything that we're seeing and talking about now with the war in Ukraine and the decoupling of the East and Western financial networks. And so, yeah, I hope people will understand why it took a little extra time to do it once they have it in their hands.
The book's kind of looking at Venezuela as it's Venezuela as a lens at looking at the multipolar global transformation and the shift in the global financial system as US dollar hegemony starts to crumble. That's the way
Yeah.
I understand it.
I mean, Max has read, I think, 90% of it, so he knows. But other than just covering how Venezuela fits into this picture of the multipolar world, or all of the other nations, profiling some of the reasons other nations are joining not necessarily anti-Western alliance, but alternative to the West alliance. It really, what I try to do is use Venezuela as a case for illustrating the mechanisms through which European and US modern imperial exploitation happens, because it's not these even wars of conquest or resource control that we saw at the beginning of the century in Iraq. It's the hybrid war of sanctions, media deception, money washing fronts like USAID that basically just act as a go-between for US government funding and non-government organizations. Basically, and of course, economic financial sanctions, how all of these tactics are really the only tools the United States and Europe had left to wage their regime change wars, especially after they were defeated in Syria. And that as they relied on those tactics so extremely and in such an unprecedented way, it forced this new world to just come together and say, look, we don't need SWIFT. We don't need the dollar. You can't abuse us like this. And so everything we're seeing now really was just the inevitable outcome of an arrogant Western imperial policy. And that's what I really try to animate through the case of Venezuela in the book.
Yeah, and I mean, you can draw a straight line from the Bank of England seizure of Venezuelan gold, billions in Venezuelan gold, to what the EU just announced, which is a seizure of close to $200 billion in frozen Russian assets in order to fund the Ukrainian war effort.
Yeah, well, after the 2022 escalation, the G7 countries, so that's basically the Western empires plus Japan, they seized 300 billion total worth of Russian central bank assets. And so I guess this newest announcement is that they're actually just going to straight up use it to fund the war effort.
And what it does is it discredits the EU and discredits the Bank of England as a participant in globalization, and thereby necessitates alternative currency exchanges, accelerates that process, and ultimately destroys dollar dominance. And that's why everyone's talking, everyone from Fareed Zakaria to there was some other mainstream voice talking about the inevitability of de-dollarization. But your book, I think, is a really good way of looking at this through the case of Venezuela, something that we've been, we all went down there at the early stage of the US run corporate coup, all three of us, and you've been following it closely ever since. So we're looking forward to that. It's on OR Books, which is also publishing Aaron's forthcoming title.
OR Books, yes.
Is it OR? I heard it referred to as OR.
The OR is how you can spell it.
OR, yeah. So,
sorry.
Unless Aaron has anything to add, we can talk. Well, we went, Anya and I, to one of the most disgusting events I've ever seen since Gallagher smashed a watermelon on me at one of his shows in the 80s. No, that was just kind of a Gen Xer joke, but yeah, it was completely disgusting. Let's start with, we're going to start this, and I'm going to take a bathroom break, but we're going to start this segment. I'm going to just intro this segment with my and Anya's interview with the Ukrainian ambassador. So Anya Parampil and I were in attendance at the Warner Theater in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd, where USAID Director Samantha Power rolled out the DIA app before hundreds of awestruck spectators alongside Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, hosted by tech journalist Kara Swisher and featuring the executive chairman of Visa and the head of the Eurasia Foundation. This app, known as DIA, D-I-I-A, has been promoted by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as a state within a smartphone. And it supposedly provides something like 18 fundamental government services and along with 120 other functions. And here I asked Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the US, about whether this whole event was designed to actually use the ravages of Ukraine and the Ukrainian proxy war to advance to accelerate the fourth industrial revolution and this dystopian digital prison that is coming into effect with digital IDs, digital passports, and a total panopticon style surveillance. So watch this exchange.
As we're waiting for it, I'm remembering I saw Samantha Power in person a year ago in Brooklyn, and I froze up, and I was trying to think of a question, but then she got into a car and she went away. So anyway,
I actually sorry, we'll fix that in post. I actually forgot to share that clip, so here's the interview.
This event was about profiting off of war, turning Ukraine into a laboratory, the ruins of Ukraine into a laboratory for the fourth industrial revolution.
You're absolutely
getting
wrong.
Ukrainians all in a digital.
You're not interested in the answer?
Please. And can you tell me why my colleague Anya Parampil is on the kill list maintained by your government? Your Interior Ministry maintains a kill list of journalists, and my partner here, Anya Parampil, is on it.
Unlike in Ukraine, you can't kill and ban your opposition here. Our Nazis actually have to hide behind the government, not serve in the government.
That was cold. Actually, at one point I wanted to, I didn't, this guy is the head of, I figured out who he was. He's the head of something called Digital Democracy that State Department backs. But if you look right here, maybe it's a little before, we can see this guy right here. I totally missed him. That's Alexander Vindman.
Oh, there's Vindman.
I wish I had known he was there. But you know, that's a
or someone who looks like Vindman. Yeah, no, that is him for sure. Yeah,
that's Vindman.
Yeah, it's Vindman.
Stand, everybody stand for Vindman. Remember when Biden did that at the in the debates? Like, who the hell is Vindman?
Yeah.
So Anya, what did you make of this event and that exchange? Give us your.
Well, I think it explained why the Western European and United States governments are so wedded to the Ukraine war, and they're willing to throw untold billions worth of dollars at what is obviously a military quagmire at this point, something that most people would have understood was never going to be resolved militarily unless they were really going to risk nuclear war with Russia, which apparently they're willing to do. Because this isn't really about a military victory. This isn't necessarily just a war that is fought on the battlefield at this point. What this event showed is how the West, and pretty much through USAID, because what USAID is the front that gives cover to the private-public partnership of Western imperial policy. So USAID goes in to countries and gives them US taxpayer money. Their slogan is actually "From the American People," I think. I saw that for the first time at this event because it was under their logo. I was like, I don't even think the American people know that they're giving people anything through USAID. But so USAID gives the US taxpayer money to nominally non-government NGOs in foreign countries, or in some cases just directly to the government. And then in a lot of cases, what that means is that those funds have to then directly be used in order to buy Western technology. Or, I mean, in Ukraine's case, Samantha Power actually just held a conference in Ukraine, in Kiev, with the leaders of Western tech and finance. And she was basically saying Ukraine is going through a really hard time right now, but it's all going to pay off when we get the future that we're planning here. And you can see that future through the DIA app and through everything they discussed at this event. And by the way, the CEO or high-level figures from BlackRock and Visa and all the major corporate vultures were in Kiev for that conference. So it's a little bit disgusting to think that these people are already there, ready to prey on the carcass of Ukraine while their men of Ukraine are still dying basically for nothing at this point. So it's really twisted. And this app and the event showed that, and they said it explicitly, that they plan to make Ukraine into a vision of the future of what they want for all of us, which is remote work and learning. Tech innovation is basically the main industry. So you just get all these investments from financial institutions to create a bunch of technology that no one really needs. They said Ukraine will be the first cashless society and be reliant on a central bank digital currency by 2030. And I mean, we can play the full clip of that. I think Max can if he wants. But basically, as Max described, all of this falls under the category of what the Davos elite describe as the fourth industrial revolution, and what they see as the future that we all should live under, including here in the United States. They think we should be living in 15-minute cities where we can access everything we need and only be plugged into some electrical grid. We don't really get gas cars anymore. They never talk about necessarily how they're going to live, Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, but they definitely are explicitly telling us that they don't expect us to own anything, definitely not have homes or even really families in the future. And that is what they are rolling out and testing already in Ukraine. They had began talking about this app in 2019, and they rolled it out as a result of the war. And something else.
Well, it was actually rolled out, Anya, before the war, and we'll play the clip by
people.
Visa's
I don't think people were using it on the same.
People were using it, but not on the same scale. But it was first used with Visa technology to incent, as Visa's chairman Al Kelly said at the event, in order to basically pay Ukrainians to take the mRNA COVID vaccine.
Yeah,
which
we don't
they
even
didn't
know
really
where they
wanna
got
do.
that money, by the
And
way.
so the question is, were US taxpayers and EU taxpayers basically having their money raked out of their pockets to bribe Ukrainians to take experimental COVID injections? But just the whole point that you're making here is that the fourth industrial revolution is being tested in a laboratory where citizens have the least power, and then it's being exported to other countries where citizens have little power to push back. As they announced at this event, Zambia and Colombia are going to be trying the DIA app, as well as Zanzibar. But let's look at, and when we
Not
talk
the
about
DIA app, but their own USAID partnership to create a similar app. I think DIA is just Ukraine, but
we can look at how this app is being used actually to pit citizens against each other and as a literal weapon, as Samantha Power said. Here's something I filmed that was so shocking during this presentation, which shows how the app is actually being used encourages people to snitch in Ukraine on their neighbors.
War bonds aimed at rebuilding the liberated and soon to be deoccupied Ukrainian cities. State mortgage. Military, medics, teachers, and scientists can apply for the state mortgage right in the app. E-Enemy, a chatbot that helps any citizen safely transfer info about the location of Russian troops, names of collaborators, and enemy movements to the armed forces. About the location of Russian
One more
troops,
time.
names of collaborators, and enemy movements to the armed forces. Numerous attacks of Russian army destroyed a number of TV towers. To provide Ukrainians with uninterrupted access to information, we launched Dia Radio and Dia TV, so that even under blackouts, millions could feel present. And added the in-app Army of Drones game to help Ukrainians both distract and donate to the common purpose. Has the enemy launched cyber attacks on Ukraine? Of course they have, and they failed. Even when the world is falling apart, our main task is to protect the people. Together, we can build a stronger one.
So we've seen the video of accused collaborators being thrown in mass graves by members of the Azov battalion. We've seen mayors killed who are accused of being collaborators in Ukraine. We've seen Ukrainian officials cheer on these assassinations, and we've seen all of the major political opposition parties in Ukraine be banned. The
Ukrainian government banned them, not just, they weren't just being banned, like somebody banned them. The Ukrainian government that we fund and pay for banned them.
Right. So this app takes on a very dark quality and while you're bored, if you're bored at all, you can play the Army of Drones game. You can pretend to be a drone going to assassinate Putin. Brought to you by Visa and Google.
They called it the Army of Drones because, as we've covered at the Grayzone with Alex Rubinstein just recently, the Army of Drones is an official initiative that the Ukrainian government has in place right now, where if you can actually pull up the web page and maybe show people, Max, or pull up Alex's article. The Ukrainian government is openly fundraising in order to purchase drones. And they even ask people or foreign governments to donate actual drones. They call them dronations instead of donations on the website. They enlisted actor Mark Hamill from Star Wars.
Mark Hamill.
Yeah. I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, to be honest.
Well, he's kind of like, 30 years ago, 40 years ago,
but anyway, so they are trying to, and they call this their Army of Drones campaign. And these are the drones that we can suspect were used not only in the attack on the Kremlin earlier this month, but also in an earlier assassination attempt on Putin, on Russian President Vladimir Putin's life. And there have been hundreds of incursions into Russian territory over the border there with Ukraine of these drones, according to Russia. And the BBC has done articles pumping up this Army of Drones campaign. There's no secret that it's going on, but then they kind of are coy when an actual attack takes place in Russia and pretend like, oh, it's a false flag from Putin. So I think a lot of people are evolved enough to see what's going on there. And yeah,
back to the Dia app. I mean, they're saying that the drone strikes, you can essentially call in a drone strike by reporting enemy locations to the Ukrainian military with this app, in which you also maintain your vaccination status, your ID card, and your
banking
and your banking info, and that Visa itself maintains the server.
I believe also that under digital or remote education, that students would, I imagine, also be engaging with their schooling through Dia. It's pretty much just supposed to be, they sell it as convenience, just like they did during COVID-19. All these people that were like, oh, I wish that we could just have a digital ID so that it would be so easy to go through airports. That's how they get you to buy into basically the digitization of everything that makes us human, everything that is a part of our daily life. They are openly saying they just want to put it in one app. They don't even want you to have cash anymore. And then it's like such a great, cool thing. You're not supposed to really question it or have any concerns about digital surveillance whatsoever. And the last point that I would just make in that regard is that as they were pumping up this app and giving their spiel and pitch at the event we attended, and they said they were boasting of how the digital ID made it very easy to track citizens and ease their travel, I think is how they spun it. But then I was thinking, wait, in a country that is conscripting all of its men to fight in a war, regardless of whether or not they actually believe in it or want to sacrifice their lives because they know that's what they're going to do if they get sent to war. What does that mean if they can control and monitor every citizen through their phone that way? And that, you can't just cross over a border with your passport anymore. You're required to pass with this phone that is your ID. I mean, it seems like it would really assist in the Ukrainian government's effort to force every single male in the country to die on the front line.
Or to be killed because they're suspected collaborators. But we've all seen the video, or we've reported on these videos of young or military age Ukrainian men being rounded up and press ganged on the street, thrown into vans and taken to the front lines, taken to Bakhmut. If you sign up for the Dia app, presumably you're using geolocation. And while Mikhailo Fedorov, the young 32-year-old Yale-trained minister of digital transformation who previously engaged in a $60 million partnership with the crypto scam known as FTX, said from the stage at Warner Theater, or claimed from the stage, all the data, that it does not store your data. But I don't believe that when it's not on a blockchain and it's being maintained by Google and Visa and USAID put up all the money for it. And then we also have the reality of Dia as it relates to the US taxpayer. Okay, $25 million was put up by USAID for Dia, but as Samantha Power, the director of USAID, claimed, were it not for Dia, $15 billion of our money would not have gone to Ukraine to literally pay public workers. I mean, this was a shocking comment that Samantha Power volunteered. She went out of her way to make this statement.
One of the things that Congress has given USAID since this full-scale invasion began is an unprecedented amount of money in direct budget support, which sounds kind of obvious. Of course, we would do that. We want to stand with Ukraine, but it's totally unprecedented, this kind of scale of investment. And we're talking along the lines of about $15 billion in a sense, cash to the Ukrainian government, which was famously corrupt, in past years and still has work, as you noted, to do on corruption today. I don't know if we could have gotten that money out of Congress if not for Dia. Because what Dia allows us to do is that direct budget support goes, yes, to the Ukrainian government, but then it goes to pay teachers, to pay healthcare workers, to pay first responders. And there's a digital trail. It's not, some official deciding this or that. It actually is going directly into the bank accounts in a manner that it would have been untraceable in a prior regime.
Well, so she's saying it's traceable. The whole point is it's traceable. So they don't have privacy, but we're directly paying teachers in Ukraine while teachers in LA just had to go on strike for better wages. We're paying healthcare workers, Anya.
It was very tricky marketing that she delivered there because obviously the Ukrainian government is so corrupt that not even Samantha Power or anybody else in Washington can deny that corruption was a major issue in the country over the last several years. And so part of how they're branding the Dia app is that it will combat corruption by making it impossible. If all exchanges and all government contracts and all documents and any permit that you need to get to build or anything is centralized in this app, controlled or under the authority of the government in Kiev, then corruption is impossible because the bureaucrats and people in charge can monitor what's going on. That doesn't actually help you if the state is the mafia that's responsible for the corruption. The Ukrainian state is not actually some civic institution that is there representing the interests of the Ukrainian people according to a social contract or sense of government obligation. It is made up of the very financial elite, pretty much, that have ties to the West and who are driving this war and had also pillaged the country ever since 2014. And through the privatization schemes and everything that came in after the Maidan coup, those are the people responsible for the corruption. I mean, Zelensky, we all know he's just an actor. He's just a comedian. His main funder, Kolomoisky, is the Ukrainian banker who, I mean, people don't really maybe understand this. The reason Kolomoisky is so hated in Ukraine is because he was overseeing the bank in Ukraine where average Ukrainians had stored their money for years. And then one day it just didn't exist. And people talk about that maybe happening here in the United States or in Europe sometime soon, but it's already something that they've shown can happen in Ukraine. Then after everybody was suddenly poor and impoverished, then they came in with this liberalization scheme and agenda promising them work through Western investment and construction, which they're going to do also after, or they would like to, after this war is over and Ukraine's destroyed.
The partnership with BlackRock.
Right. But if Kolomoisky is behind the government, essentially, people know that.
He's literally a governor of Dnipro, of one of the major provinces in Ukraine.
But if that's your government, then how is having a centralized app where everything is managed by that government actually going to stop corruption? What it's really doing is taking away the sovereignty of the people and selling it to them. They don't really have a choice in Ukraine, really, but they are at least branding it to us as, oh, the Ukrainians need this convenience and it's going to protect them from civic corruption. And they would like to convince us in the West also that accepting such an app would do the same. But we also know that our government is run by the mafia that is screwing all of us anyway. So they were complaining at that event. Kara Swisher, the editor-in-chief of New York Magazine, was complaining that Americans specifically would never accept something like this, which I hope is true. But COVID did tell us, or at least told me, that I can never be so sure, because when people get these existential fear senses in their bodies, they might agree to anything.
Yeah, that's a great point. And here is Kara Swisher introducing Zelensky's presentation of DIA, which hammers home the point that the Davos-centric Fourth Industrial Revolution arrived in Ukraine with Zelensky's election. He was advised by so many American advisors, including the now infamous Nina Jankowicz. So here's journalistic gun for hire Kara Swisher introducing Zelensky.
So without further ado, first a video from President Zelensky.
Творіння Джобса, Apple, iPhone. І це його серце. І воно б'ється з кожним вібро під час дзвінка або під час SMS.
I mean, it's interesting here, just to cut in. He's, first of all, he's humanizing the iPhone and describing it as kind of the heartbeat of the nation because it beats with every vibration. This is prior to 2022. Zelensky was speaking at the Stanford Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, which is a major spook fest. It's where Obama announced the Obama Foundation's counter disinformation plan.
А в ньому наше українське творіння держава у смартфоні.
Мільйони
in
українців
a
щоденно
smartphone.
користуються нашим державним
Millions of
сервісом
Ukrainians
«Дія».
use our
Це
state
більше
platform every
100
day. There are more
державних
than
послуг без
100 public
контакту з
services
чиновниками,
without
цифровий
needing
паспорт, відкриття
digital
рахунків,
passport,
сплата
bank
штрафів,
accounts,
податків,
fines,
отримання
taxes,
державної допомоги,
state aid,
збір коштів на допомогу
army funds.
армії. Все це українська дія. Україна не випадково стала одним із глобальних лідерів в цифровізації публічних послуг
digitizing
і
public services
соціальних
and social
відносин.
relations.
Це прямий
This
наслідок
is an
того,
outcome of what we're
на що
capable
ми
of.
здатні. Сміливість і освіта, здатність боротися за свої інтереси і знайти найзручніший
And to
шлях.
find the most
Шлях,
convenient
щоб
way. So you get the point. But this also really highlights what Zelensky was about. Again, many of those presentations that Zelensky was making about Dia took place before the war. Ukraine was always, with his election, intended to be engine or hub or a hub of the Great Reset. Anya, anything else to add about the Dia event in Washington, or your thoughts on where this is going?
I don't think it's going anywhere positive for Ukraine. It seems, and this is what I said in my tweet about the event, that Ukraine has already been sacrificed on the altar of Western finance and technology. They are not fighting this war in Ukraine because they believe Ukraine can win. I mean, the West, the United Kingdom, the United States, and its subservient European allies is waging this war not because they believe Ukraine can win militarily, but because they believe Ukraine can be destroyed, and that then they will have the chance to rebuild it according to their vision of the future, which is what they want to ultimately bring to us. And this is according to the statements that they make themselves. So we should look at Ukraine immediately as a tragedy that is a human tragedy, and something that the only conversation we should be having about it is to say that there needs to be a peace and a negotiated solution. In the entire 2 hours that these people spoke in Washington, D.C., there was not one mention of how to actually stop the death and destruction in Ukraine. So that should tell you already a lot about how these people think. And aside from the immediate demand that we should all have, which is to end this war, end the suffering of, more than anyone, the Ukrainian people, that would be real Ukraine solidarity. But then after that, we should step back and consider, what does everything that's going on in Ukraine tell us about what could become our own future, or what the people running our countries, and really the Western transatlantic elite, what their agenda is for all of us? And are we poised to actually confront it? Do we even totally understand it? I think the COVID experience helped many of us, including, I think, you and me, Max, and a lot of our friends, understand the full scope of this agenda. It's not just the CIA doing regime change wars. That's one part of a global agenda that our elite have, and they're going to turn this on us. They're going to try and convince you and me and everybody else that we should have a Dia style app, and maybe it will save us from climate change. I think that's the one existential fear that they have already said pretty much they will rely on to unveil the fourth industrial revolution to the West. But we need to be vigilant and very critical of what's going on, because I don't know how much time we have to really oppose it, especially when we consider all the rapid advancements going on in AI technology and just what they openly say, and the fact that they're willing to march us to nuclear war. So we should draw lessons from this about what it means for our own societies.
Great point. I mean, we're talking about disaster capitalism in Ukraine being but the innovations being exported around the world in the era of AI. And Elon Musk who has been in the past a supporter of transhumanism and AI, has actually said there needs to be a pause on AI technology because of the danger that it poses to humanity. Kara Swisher even came out and joked that AI would destroy humanity. But then you have Eric Schmidt in charge of the Pentagon's fourth offset, Eric Schmidt of Google, declaring that no, we have to keep AI full steam ahead because of the great power competition with China. So Anya is absolutely right. I think this is the key challenge of our time, and it's happening against the tableau of empire. And that's why I think
it's just part of it. It's just that maybe we've been zoomed in on a small piece of the tableau of empire. And then if you zoom out and see the full picture, it's far more complex than many of us understood it to be.
Definitely. Well, Anya, thanks for joining us again. Our Grayzone viewers will hopefully be getting more content from you as you wrap up this really important book on Venezuela called Corporate Coup. You can pre-order
on Western imperialism, I would say, but yes, through Venezuela.
Through Venezuela. And I got a few quick announcements. Jimmy is starting soon. Aaron Mate has left the building, but I will be in the building in person with Aaron on June 8th. If you're in the New York area at Icarus Fest. And Kurt Metzger, who's regular on Jimmy's streams, will be the headline comedian. I don't know, maybe I'll tell some jokes there. It's in Rutherford, New Jersey, somewhere in Rutherford, New Jersey. Well, you just go to Icarus Fest 2023 and IcarusFest.com. You'll find the info on where it is. There's Aaron, Sam Husseini, Michael Tracy. This is all being run by Thaddeus Russell, and they're showing some cool films there: Blade Runner, Safe, The Unredacted, and Gone with the Wind. It's at the Williams Center in Rutherford, New Jersey. I don't think that's where Jimmy Hoffa is buried. He's in Giant Stadium somewhere. And then another event the next month, I'm going to be opening for Jimmy Dore at Magooby's Joke House in the Baltimore area. So if you're in the DC, Baltimore area, come out on June 15th. I think there's a show also on, July 15th at 7 p.m. I think there's also a show on the 16th that's been added. But check Magooby's Joke House. I'll be opening for Jimmy, and Steph is going to be there as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. And thanks for liking the stream. Thanks for subscribing. We had a really good showing this time. You can support us here. And we have some huge stories coming for you. Some stories that I consider really big in the next few days. So watch thegrayzone.com, and we'll be back next week. So thanks again to everyone for being with us. And thanks, Eric Thomas, Eric T. Red, for helping us behind the scenes with this stream. Peace.